Okay, welcome everyone. This is our second session in this Buddhist perspective on grief and loss. So today I'd like to start with a little meditation that I'm adapting from one that Joan Halifax Roshi. Many of you may have heard of her. She is actually here in Santa Fe most of her time, was one of the moving forces behind Upaya Zen Center here in Santa Fe. She wrote a book called Being with Dying, and she has an entire program around working with dying. And in there's a particular meditation that's about working with grief. And so I'm going to lead you all in that. So as we did yesterday, we're just going to start with a few minutes of kind of silent meditation, mindfulness of the breath. So work with the breath in whatever way suits your mind. Um, Again, if you need a suggestion, might work with either the point at the tip of the nose, where you feel the sensation of the air coming in and out the nostrils as you inhale and exhale, or you can go to the lower abdomen about 4 finger widths below the navel. They say there's a sort of raising of the abdomen that happens when we inhale and then a falling when we exhale. And you just want to bring your awareness to that point on the surface of the abdomen there that is rising and falling with your breathing. Those are two suggestions, but there are many different ways to work with the breath. And if you have a technique that you prefer, then please feel free to use that. So we're just going to do a few minutes of silent meditation on the breath. If you do find that the mind has wandered a bit and that get distracted by other thoughts or things going on, then just notice that. There's no judgment. You simply let go of that and then return to the breath. So after a few minutes in silent meditation, I'll come in and lead you in this short reflection on grief that again comes from being with dying. So I'll ring the bowl here to begin the meditation. So now to begin this guided meditation, As we did last night, I want to encourage you to come to the heart center, kind of bring your awareness down to that point. It's in the center of your chest at the level of your heart. In Tibetan Buddhism, this is the seat of consciousness. It's also our heart center, the source of all of our emotions. And as we work with these phrases that are in this meditation, try to cultivate a very tender, open heart. So we'll mostly be working with ourselves, but also working with our awareness of others. So as I say each of these, just simply allow yourself to be attentive to them in a very gentle way. Just work with each of these phrases as best as you can for the short time that will allow between each of these. Again, before we begin, just take one really deep breath, just filling up the body completely as you inhale. And then as you exhale, just relaxing into this space. And again, bringing your awareness to the heart center. May I be open to the pain of grief. May I find the inner resources to be present for my sorrow. May I accept my sadness, knowing that I am not my sadness. May I accept my anger, fear, anxiety, and sorrow, knowing that I am none of these. May I accept my grief, knowing that it does not make me bad or wrong or somehow less for having it. May I accept my grief. May I be open with myself and others about my experience of suffering and loss. May I find peace and strength that I may use all my inner resources to help others. And may I and all those who grieve be released from their sorrow. Okay, again, it's good to be with all of you again today. I want to briefly review what we talked about last night, and maybe later in this morning session, I'll reintroduce the regulating exercise that we did, just so that you have that as a tool that you can use. Again, we are working with a subject that does have some heaviness to it. While we're going to be looking at various tools within Buddhist teachings, practices that we can use throughout today and tomorrow. This is a very difficult subject to work with. We have, again, as we talked about last night in our society, not a lot of permission to grieve. I was always really kind of disappointed in the company I worked for. As much as Levi Strauss was very progressive and forward thinking in a lot of what it did, they gave me like 3 days to grieve after my partner's loss in 1992. And you get these 3 days of bereavement leave, and then you're kind of expected to come back to work and to do all the things that you were doing prior. And we know that our society in general doesn't really have the space, nor do even most people in our lives have the space for us to grieve. This is where we can sometimes feel that we're grieving alone. But it is important that we acknowledge that this work we're doing here this weekend is an opportunity to be in touch with those feelings, to have permission to experience this. So if you do experience something that is difficult for you, again, the regulating exercise I'll introduce a little later can be useful. Um, Again, no, also, I didn't mention this last night, but I'm just a Buddhist teacher. I do my best to convey the Buddhist teachings. I'm not a grief counselor or professional in that regard. So do know that if you are experiencing things that require additional support from a professional, please do seek those out. I found that in my own experience of grief after my partner died, I did use the therapist that I've been working with specifically for that, and also, of course, attended a grief support group. These things are very, very useful. Um, I found that most of my friends, because they weren't going through the same sort of experiences, weren't as good a support as those who were. We touched on that a little bit last night. Again, how when we have our own experience of grief, how it can feel somewhat isolating. And that loss that we experience can be something that others cannot necessarily relate to, depending upon their own background or where they're at in their lives. So we often can't look to others who are perhaps sort of just going about living their lives to be the best source of support when we're dealing with grief. Um, we did talk a little bit about the nature of grief. And one thing that I'll emphasize when we get back into that again today is that really grief comes from loving. In fact, there's that little book, I didn't have it out here last night, by Joanne Cacciatore, called Grieving is Loving. And really this is what we're talking about, is that when we experience in particular the grief of others going from our lives, be they people who we're very close to, pets that we're very close to, beings who we have that strong affection for, we can see that the pain of grief is coming from our love, that our love for them is really the source of so much of this. This is what we're going to go into as our first topic today, are kind of the causes of grief. And of course, this is the most kind of direct cause of our grief, is the fact that we have lost someone who we love. There was that one phrase from that author, can't remember her name right now, that kind of grief is love having no place to go. It's not able to find the object of its love. And this is an important thing to acknowledge, again, that we're rooting so much of our grief in the fact that we love. And if we want to bypass grief, well, we then bypass love. If we are going to love others in our lives, then we're going to experience grief. Either our own having to let them go through our own passing, or their passing and our need to say goodbye to them and experience that loss in our lives. So we did talk a bit about the nature of grief. I'm not going to go through all of that again, but just remember there are many dimensions to grief, and we will touch on this a bit as well today, going a little more deeply. There's the emotional component, what we're going to be focusing on, as well as the spiritual component this weekend, how grief can have a spiritual dimension to it, and also the psychological component, what is going on in our own minds and the thought processes that we need to pay attention to. And then I also mentioned the necessity of being aware of the physical side of grief, which we won't maybe spend quite as much time on this weekend. But one thing I will share is trying to share as much of my experiences, not out of my own sort of ego or what have you, but just to make things seem quite normal for many of you who are experiencing grief at this time. But I was realizing how much I was holding in my body, and I started working with a professional body worker, massage therapist, who was really quite useful to have regular um, treatments to be able to let go of some of the grief. There would be times when I would just cry on the table, and we do hold grief in our bodies, and it is important to be attentive to our bodies, even though that's not the focus of this weekend. I just want make sure that people know they have permission to attend to their bodies in ways that maybe they didn't before. Um, Even one of my very dear friends who does body work, she passed away actually a little over a year ago, but she was a wonderful body worker, and she invited me over within a day or two after Ed's death to see if I wanted just some light touch, and that was very, very healing. There's something that happens when we work with the body that affects the mind in a very different way. So just know that all these resources are out there certainly to help process things, but grief has all those different dimensions to it. It's not solely something that we feel emotionally. It also has, again, other sides to it. So what I'd like to do is reintroduce our little agenda for the weekend. As I said, I'm not, just like the grief process, we're not going to do this necessarily linearly. We already talked about a few of these things, maybe a bit outside of the order that I have them here. I had kind of sort of my opening thoughts last night around grief, the nature of grief that I just went through in brief. And then today we're going to start with the causes of grief, but we'll see where things lead. We might end up going on to some of these other topics out of turn, and that's perfectly fine. We'll go on at some point to talk about the necessity of grief, which I have touched on a little bit last night, and the process of grieving, using grief on the path, which is, of course, the spiritual dimension of this, and then any concluding thoughts that we have. So one thing that we did do last night was have everyone introduce themselves. And since we don't have as many people here, a few of the people are not back today for at least this session at this time. Maybe since we also do have two folks who are joining us new, if people are comfortable with just doing an introduction again, you don't need to say a whole lot. Again, maybe just introduce who you are, a little bit about yourself, but mostly just to share a sentence or two about why you're here. If there's something going on in particular, if it's just a curiosity about grief and grieving in the Buddhist tradition, or if it's something that is particularly poignant for you at this time in your life. Again, I don't know that I need to say a whole lot to introduce myself. I'm just happy to be back here again today to be able to share these teachings and this time with you. So let's just do that briefly so we give everyone a chance to do that. And again, if you don't want any of your private information shared on the video, then you're welcome to let us know, and we'll pause the video when you speak. So Vanessa, if you wouldn't mind starting again today.
Sure. So I am here because I invited Don to present this. I attended his workshop, the grief and loss workshop last year with Lama Yeshe House. So what brought me to this is that my mom passed away a little bit more than a year. And I just noticed the older we get, the more we lose in terms of people, not only to death, but just our relationships change. We lose our job, we change our job. So it's just Buddhism offers a perspective on grief that's just very different and unique. And I think it offers me more comfort than other explanations of death.
Thank you, Vanessa. And thanks for inviting me again to share these teachings with the Gonpo Ludup study group. Carol, would you mind going next?
I'm Carol, and I live in Laguna Woods, so I'm not too far away from Ryan and Brian and Vanessa, who are in Costa Mesa. And I lost my spouse about 2 years ago, and although that was expected because he had terminal cancer, it was still that process of grieving. And as you noted last night, sometimes you think you've resolved all that, and something will just suddenly trigger a memory or a feeling that's very, very powerful and sort of takes you back there. I also have a number of friends who have lost spouses within the last 2 months, actually, and another friend who lost her mother 3 or 4 days ago. So I feel a closeness to them. And whenever they start into that process, I like to be able to have some loving support or tools to be able to help them through that process when appropriate. So that's why I'm here.
Wonderful. Good to have you here again today, Carol.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And then Brian and Ryan, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourselves.
Hi, I'm Ryan. I am very new to Buddhism and this sort of beautiful school of thinking. I'm here because everything that I've heard has been very intriguing to me, and this is the topic that I don't really have any tools for as of now. So I'm grateful to be here. So thanks for hosting this, and thanks for teaching.
I'm Brian. And I just really honestly saw that the group was hosting something, and I always want to take part and contribute and be part of. So the topic wasn't really more what got me here than just the red flag that Gonpo Ludup's doing something, and I want to, I want to encourage that. So I'm just glad to be part of the whole big picture. And when it comes to grief and loss, I've lost a number of friends recently, and there's sort of a conspicuous almost apathy to it. And so I think there's definitely some work to be done. And then, I've got parents that are 86 years old, so it'd be really neat to get a Buddhist perspective on what's coming. Really. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Glad you both are here. Thanks for the introductions and for being here today. Great. Lorna, would you mind?
Sure. I'm Lorna, and I live in Victoria, BC, Canada. And I'm primarily here just to understand and get a better handle on the Buddhist perspective on grief and grieving. Thank you.
Good to have you here again today, Lorna. Okay, and let's go on to Don.
Hello, I'm Don. I'm in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I saw that again Don was teaching, and so any topic is going to be amazing. But this topic in particular is really important. Just learning more in Buddhism about, just trying to keep it in my mind every day that this life is impermanent. And I lost my husband 10 years ago. My children and I went to like grief support, and we really did a lot of work, and it was really helpful. And I like feel a lot, so trying to have a balance, and I'm just very interested in Gendon's teaching on this subject in particular. And I was able to be present during my stepdad and my stepmom's death, both of them. And, it's sort of a wish for me to be able to help facilitate like people, that if I get the chance in the Buddhist way, to support people through that transition. So that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you, Don. Appreciate you sharing all that. It's good to have you again here today. So thank you all for introducing yourselves. And again, one thing I might also mention from last night that I realized I forgot to say is Guy Newland, in his book called A Buddhist Grief Observed, talks about this term. I don't think he invented it. I don't think you'd find it in the dictionary. Micro griefs, that we have micro griefs, small periods of grief that we experience, moments of grief that we don't necessarily recognize or give a lot of attention to. But that's because it's all around us all the time. We're always losing things, that at one point, we'll have our youth and vitality and what have you, and that begins to fade. And as we see the body age, we're dealing with a continual process of loss. We might be dealing with other elements of loss, and regard to the environment around us. All of us dealt with, of course, the grief of the pandemic and losing so much of what we consider to be an ordinary life. And of course, the uncertainty as to what was on the other side of it, or sort of on the other side of it, not completely, but things are different. There certainly is a different thinking to some degree in many people. So we do have this constant of change. In fact, if we start to get into this idea of the causes of grief, although, as I pointed out, love is really one of the things that is the primary motivator when we talk about the people that we lose. In terms of the entire process of grieving things that go out of our lives, it's due to the reality of impermanence. We spoke about this a little bit last night. Yeah, the only thing that is constant in the world is the changing factors of things all the time, everything changing all the time. And as I mentioned last night, of course, so much of our pain is caused because we cling to the opposite. We somehow think that everything is going to stay in some sort of fixed manner. And some things do stay relatively unchanged for a great period of time. I mean, if we look at what the pandemic brought on in terms of we had most of our lives, if not all of our lives, or we didn't have those sorts of inhibition or kind of things affecting us in that way, giving us new dimensions of how we could or couldn't experience our lives due to lockdown and all these other things that we had to go through. So we certainly did see that our lives appeared to be unchanging. We didn't have that level of uncertainty. But the Buddha says that essentially we always have that level of uncertainty. Because things change, we never know what's going to happen from day to day. Sometimes things seem to be very constant, and day after day after day, we don't notice so much change. But when things do come in that change our lives in pretty drastic ways, then we get that message. But when things are changing in a very kind of reduced way, where we don't really have the ability to notice them, then we are often blind to the grief that's happening there. So I think it is important that we have that context of understanding that everything that is involved in grief revolves around the concept of impermanence, the concept of subtle impermanence, that things are constantly changing, but also the gross impermanence that we have to experience, that is the reality of death, that every one of us is subject to experiencing at some point, and moreover, that we do have to experience the loss of others in our lives. So that is one of the kind of basic underpinnings of grief, and what is one of the causes of grief often is our not really having that awareness. Do we live our lives with the awareness of impermanence? In Tibetan Buddhism, we engage in frequently a death awareness meditation that is to help us become aware of our own death so that we recognize that that's an impetus to be able to engage in spiritual practice more wholeheartedly. But nonetheless, we also do that meditation with an awareness of the death of others, that everyone will come to that conclusion in this life. No one gets out of here alive, as they say, So this reality is something that is very important for us to accept. When the Buddha began his teachings, I'll talk more about love and grief in a moment. I want to just give a Buddhist background, especially for those of you who might be a bit newer to Buddhism. When the Buddha began his teaching of the Dharma, as it's called, the teachings that came from his enlightened wisdom, he began with a very simple structure, but it's a very profound one, and one that all the other teachings of the Buddha would kind of fit into as an exploration of the main topics in what are called the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths are the Buddha's own observation. He's not sort of saying that because of his, thinking that's how they are. It's simply because things are that way. He has noticed that, and he can share that truth with us. And of course, we as people who have some inclination towards Buddhism can begin to adopt an understanding of those truths. So what are those Four Noble Truths? First, let's talk about how they are in two sets of two and two. The first two are really getting at what our current situation is, giving us a very proper sort of diagnosis of what's happening with us. We often think of the Buddha as a very wise doctor. And first of all, we don't necessarily understand our whole predicament, and we have to understand the causes of that. So that's really what the Buddha is doing in the first two truths that I'll explain shortly. In the last two truths, he's giving us the option of how things could be somewhat different, how we could actually have freedom from all that is unsatisfactory that we discerned in the first two truths. So essentially, that's the structure of it. Sometimes when I teach on the Four Noble Truths, I call it how it is and how it could be. The first two truths really explaining how things actually are, and then the last two how there's a possibility of something very, very different, the complete opposite of what we're experiencing right now. So the very first truth is often called the truth of dukkha, this Sanskrit word that is really encapsulating a much more profound level of dissatisfaction that we experience. In English translation, it's often translated as the truth of suffering, but our English concept of suffering includes things like grief that we're exploring this weekend. It also includes pain and other, physical things that we have to go through: aging, birth, death, what have you. But nonetheless, it's only the tip of the iceberg. When we experience that, that's a reminder that we're in an unsatisfactory situation. But the rest of the time, we're also subject to dukkha. Let me talk about the other two types of dukkha in addition to that first one. We often call that first one the dukkha of pain, or of manifest suffering, the suffering that's very evident to us, that even animals get, right? Animals don't want to experience the pain of hunger or the pain of fear of their lives or what have you. So the second level of dukkha is actually called the dukkha of change. And what this is referring to is that even those pleasant experiences that we have in this life, even the delightful, delicious things that we get to experience as human beings, don't have the ability to truly satisfy, which is a bit of a hard thing to awaken to, a bit of a rude awakening, if you will, because we tend to rely upon those, especially in our culture, right? All of the attention is paid on how can we get these external things to induce these feelings of happiness so that we then can live a happy life. By having wonderful places to go to, a beautiful place to live in, wonderful people around us, all of these things that give us joyful, happy experiences. I mean, how wonderful that we have that, but we mistakenly put all of our attention on that as if it's a permanent solution to our situation. It actually isn't. It doesn't ultimately satisfy, no matter how much we engage in all of those delicious and delightful things. They will never do the trick. And moreover, if we overindulge in them, if we actually think that there's some sort of true source of happiness, if they had that ability to be that for us, then they would induce greater and greater happiness. But we know this isn't true, right? No matter how enjoyable something is, if we were to engage in it repeatedly without stop, it wouldn't lead to more pleasure. It would actually lead to painful experiences eventually. So there's lots of evidence that we can look at that shows that that element of our experience is also in this category of dukkha. It's also unsatisfactory. So it's not just the pain, those things that we clearly identify as suffering, but also the nature of even our pleasant experiences to not really do the trick. The third level of dukkha is perhaps the most profound and the one that we really have to get eventually, is that essentially we are in a sort of 24/7 state of dukkha, which is the fact that as long as we're under the control of the causes of that, as long as we still have those within our sort of mental continuum, then we will continue to experience dissatisfaction. We're never going to be completely free of that. As Lama Zopa Rinpoche said in the very first teaching I ever had from him back in 1996, in samsara, in the state that we are in of going from life to life, there are no vacations. We think that we get a vacation when we pack our bags and go to Hawaii or something and have a wonderful time on the beach for those 2 weeks, but it's not a real vacation because our deluded minds are with us, our karma is with us, all the things that cause our suffering are with us. So this already kind of moves into the second noble truth, which is the truth of the origin or the causes of our dukkha. Where does our dukkha come from? We might want to put the onus, the blame on all the things around us. Well, these all cause it, these various things are the source of it. The sources are actually within ourselves. The sources are our own deluded states of mind, our afflictions, as we often call them, and the root one being ignorance, which we'll talk about a little bit tomorrow. But even we can see that there are elements of ignorance we've already talked about today. The ignorance of the impermanence of things, the ignorance of the suffering nature of things, this dukkha. We have many levels of ignorance, but there's a very deep level of ignorance that is driving the show. But on the basis of that, we have unhealthy states of mind. We have the mind of desire, desirous attachment that grasps at things and doesn't want to be separated from them. We have the mind of anger and aversion that wants to push all the unpleasant things out of our life. We have pride and jealousy and greed and all these various iterations of the delusions. Those then induce karma. I mean, we'll talk a little bit about karma. Teachings on karma have some relevance around grief, but nonetheless, they are the mechanism by which we have all of our experiences. Through the force of our afflictions, our delusions, we engage in actions. The word karma simply means action. And we don't just mean physical and verbal actions, so that's often how we do have the manifestation of karma. We mostly mean our mental actions, what's going on in our own minds that causes us to think particular things, say particular things, do specific things. So all of those are what cause us to have the experiences of samsara, the experience of dukkha. So essentially, karma is the main direct cause of our experiences, but it's only there because it's induced by our delusions, our afflictions, which are only there because we have the root of ignorance. So this whole process that we're caught up in, we just keep perpetuating our stay in samsara. Samsara being this cycling from life to life. According to Buddhism, as just a footnote to all of this, what goes from life to life essentially is our minds. There's a very sort of subtle continuum of mind that is the thread that goes through all of our existences. And it doesn't have any beginning. It goes out in the past without beginning point that we can find. Essentially, mind is always arising from another moment of mind, giving rise to another moment. It's a continuous stream of conscious awareness. And it will go forward into the future without any stop. There's an endless quality to the mind as well. Mind will continually give rise to another moment of mind. Of course, what the nature of that mind and that experience of that mind is in our own hands. And that's what we're kind of speaking to in the terms of the other two truths that we'll get into momentarily. But essentially, this is the process by which we are experiencing this rebirth again and again in samsara, going from life to life, our consciousness taking shape with regard to another physical existence, propelled by our own karma and delusions to have that experience. And then that experience ends, you get to the end of this life, and we're forced through the karma we've created to experience another existence. And we go through the same process, and then we let that go and go on to the next existence. And the Buddha says we've been doing this since beginningless time. We've never again known a break from this. We've never known any sort of respite from that reality of being under the control of these factors. So that's the core teaching in terms of what we are in right now. And that's an important part of our awareness, even when it comes to looking at grief, to really understand that this is part and parcel of being an embodied being, of having that experience that we are going through. You know, as long as we are going to be under the control of these factors, it's inevitable that we will experience the suffering of grief, that we will have to experience loss in our lives, that we will not have everything that we want all the time, that things, people, and so on will go out of our lives, and we'll have to endure the pain of that. This is, again, something that is just a natural fact of our existence. Now, many, again, other spiritual traditions teach that. It's not something that's that earth-shaking. But when we understand it within this overall context of the Buddha saying, and this is just a symptom of a larger situation that you're dealing with, the larger situation being your stay in samsara and your being under the control of these factors to go on from life to life. In the last two truths, the Buddha essentially said, but wait, you can have something different. The third truth being the result that we could actually experience of what's called the true cessation of dukkha, meaning it's a true ending to all of this, where we will no longer have to experience this process of rebirth under the control of these factors. And then, of course, there's the bigger result that we'll talk about as well through this, which is the idea that we can also attain a state beyond just our own liberation from dukkha, from samsara, and attain the state of Buddhahood where we can help others to do that same work. But essentially, this third truth is speaking to the fact that this doesn't have to go on this way in perpetuity. We will, through the proper application of teachings and understanding, experience freedom from that, the cessation of that. And of course, the question then is, how do we do that? That's the fourth noble truth. That's the truth of the path, the truth of the teachings that the Buddha taught that we need to integrate in our own minds, that then will help us to actualize that same cessation that the Buddha has experienced, that same state of Buddhahood that the Buddha has experienced, so that we too can know that for ourselves. So the Buddha's path of liberation is not one where the Buddha is some sort of savior coming in to, take us out of our suffering just by virtue of his own compassion and love and concern for us. That's a part of the equation, but we have to do the work. We have to actually engage in these teachings and develop our own deep understanding and eventually be liberated from the causes of suffering, dukkha, once and for all. So that's the understanding that we have that kind of informs Buddha's teachings, whatever is being taught, whether it be on grief or whether it be on, karma or any other topic, is that everything is rooted in this basic idea that we are in a situation that is not so satisfactory, but there is a possibility of freedom from that through removing the causes of that, through practicing the wisdom teachings of the Buddha. So when we go back to the idea of where does grief come from, to some degree, it can also be said to be some sort of a product of this entire process, as I was explaining. If you're going to be born into this cycle of existence, to live your life as a loving human being, you're going to experience grief. It was even said in the very first sutra that the Buddha gave, of his first discourse, that this is evidence of the unsatisfactory nature of things, that we have to experience such grief and lamentation. To know that loss is a sign that we are not in a satisfactory state. But as I pointed out, it's much deeper than simply those more evident forms of suffering. But nonetheless, grief is an important indicator for us. I mentioned last night, for those who weren't here last night, I'll just remind everyone that I found the spiritual path of Tibetan Buddhism through my own grief of losing my partner back in 1992. And if I hadn't had that experience at that time, I'm not sure. Hopefully would have found Buddhism eventually, but it really became a very dynamic force in me finding these teachings to be so resonant with my experience, to really show that what I was going through was the key through which I could actually investigate the Buddhist teachings at a much deeper level. If I'd found them at another time, perhaps when I wasn't experiencing such grief, I don't know that that would have been the same result. So there is that dimension to grief that we'll be looking at. It is really the core of what we're doing this weekend, is how do we use that experience of grief to learn from it and to actually channel our understanding within the context of the Buddhist teachings and make progress on our spiritual path. But this is, again, the overall context for why grief exists. Where does grief come from? It comes from the fact that we are in an unsatisfactory state, where through the force of the impermanence of things changing constantly, and that undeniable fact of dukkha, that there is suffering, there is difficulty, there is dissatisfaction in this world, we will experience that as one of the symptoms of it. Again, I'm not trying to, when I put it in that context, belittle in any way anyone's own personal grief. I mentioned that last night. We kind of have two dimensions to it. We have the sort of specialness of our own grief that is not to be denied, that each of us are sort of going through. And if you're not experiencing grief at the moment, you'll have some time in your life when parents pass away or others pass away who are close to you, that you will know that. And that is to be respected as your own experience, that no one else can really speak to. No one else can really know. But at the same time, there's a universality to what we're experiencing as well. All beings are conditioned in this way to experience grief. And this actually is a doorway through which we can connect with others as well, and to see that although we might feel somewhat isolated in our own experience, we aren't. Others are experiencing this as well, and perhaps we can think of them as well and want healing for them as well, in the same way we did with those affirmations at the beginning of today. How we want not just the healing to occur for ourselves, our openness to our own sorrow, our own grief, but may others also, eventually be free from that and know the healing that comes from that. So back to the topic of love and its being a key component in regard to our grief. Let's go to a little thing I want to share here from again, something I got off the internet. It's fun kind of researching when I'm doing various classes. And when I did this class previously, I found this from a man named Alan D. Wolfelt. He's a doctor, he's a grief counselor. He says, you see, love and grief are two sides of the same precious coin. One does not and cannot exist without the other. They are the yin and yang of our lives. Grief is predicated on our capacity to give and receive love. And this is really and I can't emphasize it enough, but really is the main source of so much of our grief that we experience, is the loss of the object of our love. In Buddhism, love is defined not in terms of romantic love. I'll get into that in a moment, but love is defined in terms of it being a sincere wish for another to have happiness and the causes of happiness. It's the real driving force behind what allows us to be with others in that space of intimacy and connection, whether it be a partner, spouse, child, parent, pet, whoever, beings who are the object of our love. We are concerned about their happiness and well-being. We tend to them, we care for them from that space. Now, one of the things that often gets involved in romantic love, which of course is there if we do lose the object of our romantic love, if we lose our partner or spouse, is the element of attachment that influences romantic love. Attachment and love often come together in our relationships, and it is important that I highlight this as we look at where some of our pain of grief also can come from, is due to our attachment. What's the difference between love and attachment? Love, as I said, is the wish for the other's well-being and happiness. Attachment is the exact opposite. It comes from a place of ego, a place of I, and it's putting on the other person the responsibility for creating our happiness. So we often have that element to our relationships as well. And it's not just even our intimate relationships, though in romantic relationships, it's definitely there for most people. It's also how we go about relationships with family members, with friends. There's often an expectation that those beings are going to fulfill our needs, that they're going to be giving us what we need. And oftentimes we break off relationships when people or objects of our attachment no longer do that, right? This is one of the painful things about relationships, is that if we go from that place of attachment most of the time, and if that becomes our default, then there's an expectation. I'm expecting you to fulfill a particular side of the contract, and if you aren't doing that, then I don't want anything to do with you any longer, or I need to kind of adjust the relationship on the basis of that. Whereas love is, once more, if I have a genuine care and concern for the other being, for the other person, then it's only predicated on whether I'm able to in some way contribute to their well-being, be that for them, be a source of happiness for them. And of course, if we, in the world, if everyone was living their lives from a place of love and minus the attachment, then everyone would be loved and everyone would be able to love in turn. Because it's through our loving of others that they then experience that and get what they need. It's through them loving us that we then get what we need. Attachment just makes the main element of it, me getting what I want, me getting what I need. And admittedly, for some of us, our attachment to that person is also a part of our pain as we grieve, because we get so used to them being there in a way for us that satisfies our needs. Again, that can be in romantic relationships as well as any relationship. But it does lead to some unhealthy expectations. And of course, when that being is no longer there and cannot fulfill their side of the equation, then that attachment, of course, also doesn't have the object of what it needs to satisfy its own well-being. And so we end up in a similar predicament. But obviously, the love is pure. The love is the genuine part of our relationship to others. And so it is important that we understand that that's something that we're never wanting to really let go of. In fact, I ran across a wonderful quote last night. I was doing some additional reading after our talk last night, and I think it's in this book, where he talks about kind of essentially we're never really talking about getting rid of our love in any way, shape, or form. You know, it is our love that actually carries on. I can't find it right now, but I think it's good enough for me to have given that sort of paraphrasing of it. You know, our grief is not ever letting go of the love for that person. That love for that person and our genuine heart connection to them and our concern about their well-being can even go beyond this life. Of course, in Buddhism, when we acknowledge that there is a continuity of mind and those loved ones that we have in our lives that pass away don't completely disappear. Their consciousness goes on to another existence, and we can continue to have that heartfelt concern for them and what is happening with them. In fact, in Buddhism, a lot of attention is given, in Tibetan Buddhism in particular, to a lot of prayers and practices that are done, particularly in the 49 days after someone passes away, because in that period of time, it's very important that we do what we can to make that connection with them, have some guiding influence with them. Those 49 days are the time when they will be transitioning potentially into their next existence. So there are some kind of teachings again that support that whole idea that our love can definitely carry on. But our attachment is problematic. Our attachment is not a healthy state of mind. It's actually one of these afflictions, delusions that we want to get rid of. It's rooted in ignorance, and it is, really just a force through which we end up getting into a lot of trouble. Now, having said that, I also want to admit that attachment does have some role to play in terms of inducing us to develop close relationships with others. The love will be more sustaining. The love will be healthier, to continue to work from that place. But nonetheless, attachment does play some role in that. And by attachment, I'm not necessarily equating this to, I don't know that much Western psychology, but there's a whole philosophy of what happens around newborns and the attachment to the mother and father, the parents, and all of this. We're not talking about that level of attachment there. That's something that is a healthy bond that is created that allows for that life to be sustained of that newborn and for the parents to continue to have their affection for their loved one and so on. So I'm not equating it to everything that happens in our lives that has any label of attachment. Rather, attachment is this mental component where we actually look at things from the perspective of me and what I need from that person. So to go back to what I was talking about, grief is essentially caused by a number of factors. As I was started off explaining, a lot of it are ignorance of the reality of things and people not being sort of anticipating that that is a part of life, to lose our loved ones, to lose all the things that we have in our life eventually. But also, grief is a product of our love, and grief can also be exacerbated by our attachment. Our attachment that is seeking an object of satisfying our needs. And for those people who have more addictive types of minds, we can see how grief can manifest in addictive behaviors that seek out other sources of that satisfaction, that perhaps go to drugs, alcohol, sex, whatever, various things that satisfy things in a very temporary way, but obviously don't get at the root problem. So it's just, again, delineating those two. Love and attachment will come as a package for most of us, but we have to understand the different nature of each of those. So maybe I'll just open it up here before I go on to the next topic and see if there's are there any questions on this, or is this clear, the differentiation between love and attachment? And can you see how they play a role in relationships that you've had or that you have right now? Anyone?
I just have my thought on that is when I start learning or studying Buddhism and see the difference between love and attachment, it actually makes me not want to get involved in romantic relationships. It's like I'm so scared. It's always, because my past experience is always really like unhealthy attachments.
Mm-hmm. And again, maybe in a relationship with someone who has an understanding of the hazards of attachment, you could work with that, would maybe perhaps be a different experience. I think because again, in our culture, we equate the two and there's no differentiation of them. And so we think that if you don't have that expectation of the other person to meet your needs, that's almost unhealthy. Whereas it's unhealthy, to have that, and it's much healthier to simply have love, to have this unbridled concern for the welfare of another that you come from in terms of your relationship. I mean, it sounds pretty outrageous, but if you had that concern for somebody and you really were genuinely wanting them to be happy, then if they were to leave you for someone else because they thought they would be happier, you would be happy at that. You would be like, oh, I'm so happy that you're finding. And of course, our culture is the exact opposite, right? Because it's at that moment that the person feels betrayed. Why? Because they thought that that person was the source of their happiness and only their happiness, and they didn't want others to be involved in that and so on. So again, it becomes really tangled up. And I agree, when we begin to differentiate these, we can see that in the world at large, it's very hard to navigate a relationship that's purely based on love compared to one that is our standard relationship that has both of them intertwined. But the attachment is what causes the pain. We never have pain from love. Love is a feeling that can only give joy and well-being and happiness when we truly care about another and we are delighted to do whatever we can to help them, to find temporal happiness, but of course the main goal, to find ultimate happiness, to find deeper states of well-being. But nonetheless, it can be a bit intimidating and a bit putting us off of the desire to be involved in all of that. But I would say again, perhaps if there is that understanding of what's going on. In fact, there are many people, even many of you may have read M. Scott Peck's book, The Road Less Traveled, where he essentially defines love. I'm going to probably muck it up a little bit. This is my paraphrasing of it. Love is being the concern for another person's spiritual well-being. I mean, really, that's a different revolutionary concept of love, right? When we talk about love in our general culture, that's not what we mean often. We mean this intertwining of my needs being met by yours and my meeting your needs and so on. It becomes a very insular sort of thing. But if my sole concern is the spiritual welfare and development of the other person, that's a genuine source of love according to Buddhism. But that takes a while to get there, I think. Yeah, Carol, please.
I want to offer a book because it deals exactly with what Vanessa is talking about. And it's called Mindful Loving. And I can't remember the name of the author right now. And it deals with that issue because I went through this with someone that we were engaged, the whole thing, and then he broke it off. And I went through such trauma, that rejection kind of thing. And my therapist introduced me both to that book and that perspective of expectations, which, I think there's saying I think it's AA, that unfulfilled expectations lead to resentment, well, and a lot of other things. But I just want to recommend Mindful Loving, Vanessa. I think you might find that really helpful, or anyone who is trying to negotiate a relationship in terms of taking that other perspective of caring for yourself, but also taking a look at what's happening with the other person. And I was able to turn that around in this relationship and just say, if that's what makes you happy or that's what you need, hard as that was for me to say that, because the ego is all tied up in this, it actually resulted in our negotiating and renegotiating the relationship. So I found that very, very helpful, plus the guidance of a therapist through that. But the book is very powerful.
Wonderful. Thank you for suggesting
Just wanted
that,
to share
Carol.
that. Vanessa.
Yeah.
Don't give up on romance.
Yeah. Maybe take
Completely.
that book to the cafe with you and see who comes and sits by you while you're reading
there
it.
we go.
It'll be the test. If they, want to be involved in mindful loving, then, or are interested in it, then maybe
Really
there's
good.
somebody who's a potential partner. But I agree. I mean, there are many, I don't know. As a lay practitioner, I've never been ordained. I've never been a monk in Tibetan Buddhism or anything. I really do see the value of a lay life having many different dimensions to it that are valuable for spiritual experience. Obviously, there are great advantages to shutting oneself off from being involved with others, in that way, as is done in, monastic life. Or even in those lay people who decide to kind of abstain from that element of their life. But there's, again, many dimensions to our lives that aren't fully fulfilled, I think, without all of that. And I often do try to encourage people to bring more mindfulness, more conscious awareness into their relationships, because that's what enriches them and makes them so much more meaningful. And of course, I think it has a big impact, as we're talking in this weekend, on our grieving process as well. When we have been mostly from a place of our own genuine love for the other person, yes, the grief will be there. But a lot of the more painful parts of it that are caught up in our own attachment to that person and our own seeking out what we need from that will be absent. And I think the love will be able to be sustained much more easily on the basis of that. So again, I wouldn't give up on romantic love either, perhaps, but to acknowledge that there are ways that we can make sure that there's something more fulfilling about that, and something that can actually help us to have a more rewarding experience in this life, as well as whenever we happen to lose that person. So there's a lot of practice we do with others. It's a whole nother course, perhaps. I have done some courses on conscious relationship and how it's really good grist for the mill to work with what we're doing. In fact, a book on that, another book on that whole idea that I might mention is David, I think it's Richo, R-I-C-H-O. I think, I don't know if it could be pronounced Rico. I really have never heard his name pronounced, but I think he has it's called the 5 Keys to loving mindfulness or something like that. Anyway, I'll find the title during the break here and I'll be sure to share it with all of you. But yeah, there are many dimensions to our relationships that we need to be aware of and explore with that consciousness, with that understanding that these can be pitfalls to the relationship when everything is driven by attachment, but there can be great advantages to the relationship when it's driven by love and by that genuine caring and concern for another. Let's take a little break here. As I mentioned last night, I think it's good even with a 2-hour session to at least have a stretch break. So if it's okay with everyone, let's just do like, I don't know, it's 5 minutes. Okay, great. I found the book. It's actually, that was the subtitle, 5 Keys to Mindful Loving. It's how to be an adult in relationships. This is the book I often use when I teach on conscious relationship, but I'm very curious about the one that Carol mentioned on mindful loving. So again, How to Be an Adult in Relationships by David Richo. I'm always suspicious of these things. He has like 5 things that start with a letter A that he encourages to be in relationships. I'm always suspicious when people have like, how did you find 5 exact words to encompass everything that you want to teach about? But that all start with the letter A. But nonetheless, it's a very good book. So let's go ahead and see if there are any other questions or comments about anything we've talked about so far, especially this idea of love, attachment, any of the other causes of grief.
Yeah, I was just thinking I teach elementary school and I kind of end up with experience of sort of like Groundhog Day. I get up in the morning, I do some prayer, a little meditation sometimes, and I'm going to work and I have such a great positive attitude. I love these kids. I'm here to do what I can to help. And by 10:30 in the morning, there's smoke coming out of my ears. And I think, now that we're talking about it, a lot of that is attachment, right? I want them to give me something that I'm looking for to help for me, which is I want you to behave. I want you to do what I want you to do. I want you to follow directions. I want you to pay attention, raise your hand, all those good things. But the anger comes from, because I want me to feel good. I want my day to go easily. It's not about how I want you to do.
Right.
So just came to mind.
Yeah, no, I think when we begin to become aware of attachment, we can see how much it plays a role in the sort of ups and downs in our lives. Because as was said by Carol, I mean, it leads to expectations. It leads to, well, we're doing all of this from our side. Come on, you got to, ante up here. You got to do some things from your side to kind of pay us back for all of that. And it's not to say, to your point, Brian, that wanting children to kind of react well to what you're giving them, the teaching that you're giving them, the skills that you want them to develop. That isn't the problem, because those are good motivations, right? We want others to have happy lives and to be, have a meaningful existence and do all the things that they're called upon to do in this life, and to have the skills to be able to do that. So that isn't the problem. The problem is when we have the expectation that because we're doing it in a particular way, that then we're going to get that benefit of them doing it for us, so that we get the pat on the back and all the things that we need from our side. It's very hard to do this in a truly selfless way, to be unconditional in our love for another and our concern for another. I don't think we can have that expectation that we can do that immediately without some sort of training. But that's what we want to ideally move towards, is so that there's never any of that thought. And usually in most relationships, again, school might be different because you're dealing with kids who are at a different age and with different sort of abilities at that time of their life. But nonetheless, in most relationships, eventually people will reciprocate. It just happens naturally when we come from that place. But it is good to have the context of understanding that. That's why these books like, Mindful Loving and so on are important for both parties to be aware of. But for kids that you're teaching, they don't have that sort of understanding. They're still probably working from very much an I-centered kind of mentality, what they need, what they want. And so when we see them not reacting in the way that you ideally would like to, I think it's good to have that awareness and to say, well, this is just where they're at. They're doing the best that they can. I can keep doing what I'm doing out of my genuine love and concern for them and not be so invested in the results that I need to see in the moment to make me feel good. And just keep doing the work because you eventually do want them to have that benefit. Yeah. Does that help a little, Brian? Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yes, Lorna, please.
I'm just wondering, is there no such thing as some healthy expectations in relationship with another, like, not wanting to be harmed or that kind of thing, like just some basic sort of common regular things on how we treat each other is.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I don't want to say that, being a doormat is equivalent to having unconditional love, because I don't think that's the meaning of it at all.
Right.
What we need to understand is that and in fact, if we look at it, if I was in an abusive relationship and the other person, when they're abusing me, is that helpful to them? Does that lead to their happiness and well-being? If I genuinely love them, then I should be doing what I can to keep them from doing that type of behavior, because that's not good for them as well. It doesn't
Right.
lead to their happiness.
Right.
So we can always use that criterion, is whether what they are engaging in is it beneficial or helpful to them. If it isn't, if it is something that would fall into the category of what in Buddhism we simply call non-virtue, it's not something that is wholesome and leads to positive results, well, then we should want them to stop that. And we should want to do whatever we can to help them to avoid that type of behavior. And by virtue of our concern for them, that also will keep us from having to experience that abuse ourselves, right? Because if we are
Right.
attentive to it in that way, from a genuine concern for who they are, rather than solely from a place of, hey, you're hurting me now and this isn't right and you need to stop it, blah, 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 blah. If we look at it from the point of view of this behavior isn't helping you either. Yes, it's hurting me,
Right.
but the main objective can continue to be, this is also hurting you. So our love can sustain us through all of that. And it doesn't necessarily have to become attachment, but nonetheless, yes, we do want to have that equal regard for what they're engaged in and whether that's helpful to them. Just like in relationships where you've got codependency going on, or you have somebody who is dealing with their own levels of abuse, self-abuse through substance abuse, alcohol, what have you, and we're facilitating that through not addressing it. That's not love. That's, codependency is not love.
Right.
It's not a genuine expression of our concern for them. So again, I don't need to go into that, whole corner
Right.
of things, but I think that, does that help to give
Yeah,
a
no, that
context?
helps about, once again, that their destructive behavior is harming themselves as well.
As well as you. And
Yeah.
admittedly, it's not good for them to harm you. I mean,
Yeah. You have to
but
make some decisions around that,
yeah,
Can I
yeah.
help this situation or do I just leave kind of thing? So,
Yeah, and I think there can be times when maybe it's beneficial to stay in a relationship because we feel that we can, through our love for that person, help them to overcome some of these patterns and behaviors. But oftentimes it's beyond our own ability. And maybe it is best to separate or to at least seek out professional help that can be an intervention and an ability to work with that person individually or with both people together to work through those patterns of abuse, because they're not healthy for a relationship at all, but they're certainly not healthy for the person who is the abuser. But oftentimes it's not that black and white. This person is totally the abuser and the other person is totally the victim. I mean, there's often interplaying of these roles. Relationships get pretty messy. They don't always have that kind of fine line. But if we don't want to suffer ourselves and we don't want the other person to suffer and we genuinely love them, then we'll want that to stop.
right.
So,
No, that's great. Thank you.
any other comments on this? So again, I think that we can see that there are many dimensions to why grief arises, and I'm not trying to pigeonhole any of these. Obviously, there are probably many other factors that I'm not sharing simply because I'm wanting to keep it within a Buddhist understanding of where it comes from. Now, does this mean that the person who is fully evolved, like some sort of wonderful being who's integrated these teachings completely, that they don't grieve at all? I don't think that that's necessarily the case. In fact, I'm going to share a little bit from His Holiness the Dalai Lama. This is in the Book of Joy. Some of you have probably read this wonderful book that is he and Archbishop Desmond Tutu had a dialogue back in, I think, 2016 this was, and these are some of the records of that dialogue. And he says, this is the question that the Dalai Lama poses to, yeah, no, it's this question he shares, and then he goes on to give his answer. He says, I often receive questions, the Dalai Lama said, from those whose dear friend or parent or even child has passed away. They ask me, what should I do? I share with them from my own experience. My beloved main teacher who gave me my monk's ordination died, and I was really grief-stricken. While he was alive, I always felt like he was a solid rock behind me that I could lean on. I really felt very, very sad and full of grief when he passed away. The way through the sadness and grief that comes from great loss is to use it as a motivation and to generate a deeper sense of purpose. When my teacher passed away, I used to think that now I have even more responsibility to fulfill his wishes, so my sadness translated into more enthusiasm, more determination. I have told those who have lost their dear friend or family member, it is very sad, but this sadness should not translate into more determination to fulfill should translate into more determination to fulfill their wishes. Sorry. If the one you have lost could see you and you are determined and full of hope, they would be happy. With the great sadness of the loss, one can live an even more meaningful life. And of course, this is something we're going to continue to explore through this weekend, is how do we make meaning, sort of that sixth stage of grief, out of this experience of loss that we have. But His Holiness readily professes this. He even talks about, of course, his mother, his dear mother who passed away some years ago, and the grief that he felt at that time. I think it is a natural occurrence for us to have those feelings of sadness, but how they can get compounded or aggravated is certainly up to our own minds. So I think a being who's fully evolved, who has some greater understanding of these teachings, isn't necessarily not going to grieve, but their understanding of these dimensions that they can apply, as we'll go into, and how we can become aware of the process of grief and making meaning of grief, that all of that will have a different side to it than perhaps the person who gets lost in grief. I know from people that I knew in San Francisco, of course, as I mentioned last night, my partner died of AIDS in 1992. Of course, I had been living in San Francisco since 1979, and so I was there for the bulk of that, beginning of the epidemic there of HIV and what have you, and saw many people lose people in their lives and not be able to recover from it, not be able to find a way out of that grief. That's where, again, the experience of grief has its own sort of nature, but what we add to it in terms of our own thoughts and our own processes is really up to each individual. And some people can definitely become lost in it because it's a very, very difficult process, as many of you know, to kind of be open to those feelings of sadness and so on. So the next topic I do want to touch on as part of this weekend is to talk about the necessity of grief. I did share a little bit of this last night. Let's go on to that topic, and I'll share a quote here from Steve Leader. This is a wonderful book I read, probably I think it was at the end of maybe last summer or end of last year. The Beauty of What Remains. He lost his father. He's a Jewish rabbi from the LA area. Can't remember the name of his synagogue, but essentially he has written a couple of books, and this one was really struck me, and it was really quite nice because as he goes through dealing with his own process of grieving his father, he also talks about the other people he's helped in his life, and many different dimensions of grief are spoken of in that book. He says, we lose so much love to death, and if that love was real and deep, the grief is real and deep. Grief is not a race to be won or an illness to be cured. To deny grief its due is to deny love. So as I said last night, it is absolutely essential that we go through grief to get to the other side. You can't circumvent it. You can't bypass it. I suppose, again, as I mentioned earlier today, you can bypass it by bypassing love. If you want to choose to have a life where you don't have any beings that you love, no pets, no friends, no people that you extend your heart to, well, then you will probably not experience much grief because you won't have that pain of loss from losing those who you love. But you will have missed so much of what love can afford, the genuine being with others from that place of concern for their happiness and well-being. So it is absolutely essential that we go through the pain of difficulty of it. Rumi, the great Sufi poet, says the healing of the pain is in the pain. It's kind of a homeopathic sort of remedy, right? By enduring the pain of grief and by going through what we have to endure to get through the process, that's actually the way through the process. There's no other way to relieve the pain of grief. Of course, one of the things that we become exposed to in dealing with the grieving process is understanding our own vulnerability and, of course, our own mortality. I know that for me, when I lost Ed in my life, that was really a wake-up call to me. At that time, I was 34 years old. I hadn't been thinking that much about death. Of course, I had to the degree that I was exposed to it through the epidemic and what have you. But it hadn't really hit home quite as strongly for myself, to really see my own mortality being shown to me through Ed's passing. And of course, what happened to me in the epidemic, many people I knew had very different experiences. Right from the beginning of the HIV epidemic, they had people in their lives who were dying. And we saw the similar thing with this pandemic. I didn't have anyone that I knew who died of the COVID, but I knew of people and kind of heard it from a distance. Well, in terms of HIV, it was kind of way out in this periphery, and then it became closer and closer. It was coworkers at one point, and then it was friends, and then it came into my own family and my own home life, and my partner passing away. So there was a sort of tightening of this circle around me that I couldn't avoid. And when it finally hit home with the death of Ed, I saw my own mortality so clearly. But I think this also, when we talk about that spiritual dimension of the necessity of grief, this is an important part of it. If we go through the grieving process, but we don't wake up to our own mortality, I think this is also a missed opportunity, to really be able to examine the teachings that the Buddha gives on how we generate a deeper awareness of death as an impetus to use this life more fulfillingly. That's a really important part to pay attention to. Again, I don't need to go into all of those teachings. Some of you have had those before on how death awareness is very important. We have to understand three main things, though, that I'm just going to emphasize. One is the inevitability of death, which when we do see the loss of another in our lives, brings that home again. I keep getting that point. We're all going to die. Venerable Rabina, many of you know her. She just taught for all of you recently, I think, yes. She one time when she was here, I mentioned to her that one of the members of our community had just passed away, got the email saying, and so on. And she said, all I can think about when I hear that news is someday that'll be me. Someday it'll be, and Venerable Rabina has passed away, and da 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 da. We always have to hear that whenever we have loss in our lives is a mirror to our own mortality. So that's a very straightforward one. The second one, though, is that the time of our death is incredibly uncertain. That's that idea of the uncertainty of things that the Buddha also pointed to as part of the unsatisfactory nature of our lives. There's nothing reliable about this existence that we're in. We like to think, oh, I'm going to live to a nice ripe old age and have, plenty of time to do whatever I need to do. But death can come today. And we saw that again in the pandemic, how it came very quickly for many people in the early days of the pandemic. They were living their lives just like everyone else and succumbed to the virus and were gone very quickly. This is the reality that we have even outside of the pandemic. We don't know what's going to happen in every day of our lives. We like to think that it's going to go on for quite some time, but that is not guaranteed in any way. So it's important that we have some awareness of the uncertainty of death. Certainly if you've lost someone in your life where you're experiencing the grief where that death was very sudden, then we really get that message perhaps a bit stronger because that person was just going about their life and had an accident or something happened that caused them to lose their life so quickly. But this is important for all of us to understand from a spiritual dimension, because if we don't have that awareness that death can come at any day, we keep putting off our spiritual practice, keep putting off what we really need to do that's meaningful with this life. The third is, of course, examining that. What is the most important thing for this life is to use it for spiritual practice. When it comes to the end of this life, all the things that we have, even all the people in our lives, all of that gets left behind. And we can't take any of that with us. But what goes on from life to life, as I mentioned earlier, is our consciousness, our mind. And what we have done to develop our minds goes with our mind. None of that is lost. All the work we do on increasing our compassion, increasing our love, our concern, our kindness, all of that goes on. And of course, our wisdom. So those three things I just want to mention as part of this, the necessity of grief, not just as something we have to experience and go through, but also as an important component of our spiritual development. And I'll point back to my own going through the loss of Ed, and I didn't really have a spiritual practice at that time. I mentioned last night I'd left the Roman Catholic Church. I think I left the church when I was 19. I just really wasn't finding it to be in line with my own beliefs and my own thinking. And I was without any sort of spiritual tradition for many years. And although I'd kind of heard of this and dabbled in that, I really didn't have anything that kind of stuck until I experienced Ed's death and found Tibetan Buddhism through the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying by Sogyal Rinpoche. So again, our grieving can be an important and a necessary step sometimes in either causing us to move in a more spiritual direction or increasing our enthusiasm for what we already are doing, to recognize the importance of that because we've been confronted with the reality of death, with the reality of loss. This often happens, to go back to the idea of, we're going to go into these 5 stages of that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross identified around dying that are equally applicable to working with grief. But people who confront their own mortality by having been given a prognosis of some number of months that they will probably live on the basis of that doctor's observation, often do go through a very deep spiritual quest, that comes about through the force of their processing that reality. Well, we need to wake up to that reality now. That reality isn't only there when somebody gets a prognosis of so many months. That reality is there every day for every one of us, our own mortality. So again, I'm just pointing that out as part of all of this to understand that we all are vulnerable when it comes to the reality of death, and it's unclear as to when that will happen. Another thing that kind of, when we talk about the necessity of grief, is also to help us. We already talked about kind of the idea that our love goes on, and we're not letting go of our love when we say goodbye to that person or when we process through whatever our grief reveals to us, but rather we're enriching our love, but we're also enriching our gratitude. There's a lot of emphasis on gratitude these days, and they've done a lot of studies in science to show the positive effects of gratitude. It's one of these elements of positive psychology, that when we live our lives with a more grateful heart, or gratefulness, as Brother David Stendal-Rost often calls it. I really like that term rather than gratitude, a gratefulness. We have of this fullness of the heart that is grateful for what we have. This can also be enhanced through the process of grief. Now, should be grateful while that person is still there. Obviously, every day of our lives we can experience gratitude for them and for what they do for us and for the presence that they have in our lives and so on. But when we experience the loss of someone, this can also be a doorway for us to have incredible gratitude for all that they did for us. That was a bit in what I read from His Holiness there, right? His gratitude towards his teacher for having given him the teachings that he continued to share in his life. He continues to share them to this day, and give him an even renewed sense of the wanting to repay that kindness through continuing to teach the Dharma and so on. So I think every one of us can experience, again, the opportunity for greater gratitude in our lives when we have experienced loss, to really kind of be aware of the benefit that we've received from others, and to have that genuine kind of, again, gratefulness is the only word that comes to mind, but just really being in touch with that so that we live from that place. Of course, remember that this is a whole dimension of our lives that we do need to be aware of, is just experiencing the love that we can with others. Talked about that a little bit earlier as well. Just kind of looking at my notes to see what else I had to talk about in regard to this necessity of grief. I think the other thing that is really important is that this does help us to connect with others suffering as well. When we go through the process of grieving, it is painful for ourselves, but it can also be an opportunity for us to connect with the suffering of others. We're going to talk about this a little bit more tomorrow when we look at kind of how we can use our experience of grief as a doorway to enhance our compassion and our genuine concern for others. That is part of this Mahayana path of Tibetan Buddhism. But if we don't go through the process of grief, then we don't know what others are experiencing to some degree. I remember when my grandfather died, my brother and I don't know why my sister didn't go with us, but my brother and I went up to Wisconsin where the funeral was going to be. We weren't allowed to go to the funeral, but nonetheless, my parents brought us along. And of course, my father had just received the news of his father's passing, and this hit him really very hard. But as a kid, we didn't understand this at all. And, so my brother and I, we thought we were going on a road trip and we were having fun and playing games in the back seat. And at one point, my father actually got very angry at us because this wasn't where he was at all, and he felt like it was even maybe perhaps a bit disrespectful. But if we don't know grief, if we don't really know that experience, it's very hard to connect with what others are going through, right? And maybe as a kid, you're not expected to have that level of understanding. But as adults even, I think sometimes we don't really know the dimensions of grief until we have experienced it ourselves. Now, can we know another's grief deeply, intimately? As I said earlier, I don't think that that's really possible, but we can understand the general idea, what it is like to have our heart sort of ripped open and to experience that person no longer being in our lives or whatever it is that we are grieving. So it definitely helps us to connect to other suffering, perhaps even to reach out to others in need. This is something that I see again and again in looking at so many of the teachings on grieving. I'll share a little bit of that again tomorrow when we talk about it, enhancing our compassion. But many people find great meaning in life through their grieving process by coming up with ways to help others who are in need. So if there is something that happens that is due to a particular fault or something, they might be trying to address that fault in society. It's comparable to what I mentioned last night with so many of the parents of the Parkland school shooting victims, as well as the other students who had to watch their fellow students being gunned down, that they decided to devote so much of their lives and energy and even resources to trying to make sure that this doesn't happen again, or if it happens, to at least have more in place to be able to address it. So there are many ways that people find their grief to be a doorway to being able to connect with the suffering of others and perhaps help them address their needs through some sort of charitable work, what have you. And that whole idea of finding deeper meaning in life through that or through other avenues, which can be, again, up to the individual. Not everybody's going to take on a campaign to end gun violence on the basis of their loved one dying from gun violence. But nonetheless, how do you make your life meaningful for others? I want to share a little quote that kind of addresses this idea. His Holiness addressed it to some degree in the quote that I shared there about making your life meaningful on the basis of losing that person. This is from poet and author David White. He says, "The only choice we have as we mature is how we inhabit our vulnerability, how we become larger and more courageous and more compassionate through our intimacy with disappearance." This actually is a quote I wanted to share earlier in regard to vulnerability. Another one in regard to meaning is from Viktor Frankl. Many of you have perhaps read the Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, who was a Holocaust survivor and a really powerful book. He says, "Without suffering and death, human life cannot be complete." So we see again that the necessity of going through grieving is to help us to see our own vulnerability, to see our own death, but more or less to connect, moreover, to connect with the suffering of others, to actually see that we can find great meaning. I was really struck when I read Viktor Frankl's book, how he noticed that even within the concentration camps, that the people who kind of lost some sense of meaning or purpose in life were the ones who generally would die, sometimes without even being taken to the gas chambers or wherever. They would just die because they lost their hope. They lost their identification of something bigger than themselves. And it's amazing that in the midst of the concentration camps, that anyone was able to hold that perspective of a meaning greater than oneself, a purpose that transcended that very difficult situation, dismal situation that they were in. But nonetheless, those who had that had a much different disposition as they were living, as well as if they were able to survive the camps, to be able to use that in their lives. Meaning is a very important dimension to all of this, as we're going to talk about in a moment when we get into these sort of stages, the process of grief. So that whole topic, again, I've added a number of things in there, but the necessity of grief and why it's an important doorway for us to learn, to open to. Any comments or questions on that? Anything anyone wants to share from their experience or what have you? Know that it's kind of going against the flow in some regard when we do open up to our grief. A lot of people in society, as I've mentioned, don't really want to be around those who are grieving or want you to sort of get to the other side. We have to understand, though, when people are speaking from that perspective, oftentimes it's their own discomfort with our pain and their desire for us to be free of that, which in its nature is, a wholesome thought. But nonetheless, we do have to respect what we need to go through. And it can be rewarding on many different dimensions. That's not necessarily what people need to hear right immediately upon losing someone. Oh, there's gold at the end of the rainbow, or whatever, that there's light at the end of the tunnel, all these various things that speak to the fact that there can be some promise of something beneficial from that process of grieving. That's not what people are necessarily needing to hear right from the beginning. But if we have that perspective ourselves through our own process of grieving, then that can perhaps be an example to others, how we can use what we've done, what we've gone through as a means to accomplish greater purpose and meaning in this life. So let's go into the process of grieving. I want to spend a little bit of time on this, and we may not even finish this with the time that we have today. But I think this is something we've been exposed to, I think, in our culture much more. I remember reading, actually, back in Catholic school, I remember reading Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's first book on death and dying, and it was called On Death and Dying. The subsequent book on grief and grieving, I don't know that I've even read it entirely through, but it definitely follows that same sort of pattern of what On Death and Dying was speaking to. On Death and Dying was looking at it from the perspective, again, of the person who has been given this prognosis or something that they are anticipating their own death. And as I said earlier, we're all going to die, so we can certainly use some of the same sort of tools. But it's more profound when someone has actually recognized that their death is much more imminent, that it is something that will occur in the fairly near future. And these 5 stages are essentially mirrored in the grieving process. So I'm just going to go through them briefly in terms of death, because it is important that we see how they are understood there and how they do perhaps have a bit more of a linear quality when it comes to one's own prognosis of dying compared to grieving. Now, it's not to say that they're exactly linear with everyone who approaches death, because some of the work may have been done previous to this, or different perspectives might temper some of these so that they don't play as key of a role. But the very first one is denial. And they often see this with people who've been given that prognosis from a doctor, perhaps of, well, you've got this type of cancer, it's stage 4, it's stage, whatever, you've got a prognosis of so many months or years. How the initial, mindset is to deny that reality, to not want that to be true, to perhaps even go to other doctors, which isn't a bad idea, to make sure that it is correct, but nonetheless to kind of work, even when you've heard it from repeated doctors, to still work with a mind that wants to deny that reality. And of course, that has to be overcome at some point prior to death, hopefully, so that there can be some level of acceptance, which is the final of these. But nonetheless, denial can play a key role, particularly at the beginning. And all of these are not meant to be looked at in a negative light, by the way. When we are engaged in some form of denial of our grief, as we'll talk about, that's not necessarily problematic. It can be problematic if it's sustained for an unhealthy period of time. These are defense mechanisms that we have that cause us to adjust to a changing reality. Yeah. Remember that quote I read from The Year of Magical Thinking of Joan Didion last night. You know, when you have a sudden death and you're faced with that reality of like there's before that person died and after that person died, and it's a very stark difference in terms of your experience of life on the other side. But you know, when we have something that we are anticipating happening, our own future death, it is important that we have a process for acclimating to that reality, to not having to face it all at once. As I said last night, I don't know how people do that. I haven't had to experience that type of loss in my life where it was sudden and the stark reality was in my face and having to confront it. It was difficult enough confronting it with Ed, even though I knew for years that, you know, his death was imminent at some point. So, second of these stages is anger. Of course, in Buddhism, we often identify anger as one of these unhealthy states of mind. But anger here can have many dimensions to it in terms of how one rails against the fact of one's own mortality, as it was originally taught again by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross as a stage of coming to acceptance of one's own death. Anger is when denial has sort of fallen away. We have to face the reality of it, but we think it's unjust and unfair that it's happening to us, and therefore have a mind that is intent upon expressing that anger, perhaps, or coming from that place of anger. It can be a very difficult place to be. And again, people will go through these stages in different ways, depending upon their own temperament and who they are. But it's important to give some face to that. His Holiness the Dalai Lama has often said that, you know, anger in and of itself, although we identify it as a delusion, there are some dimensions to it that perhaps are useful. You know, that sort of self-survival that happens, that is a reaction to one's own mortality, can sometimes be beneficial in the moment. If it's carried out for too long, and if the person becomes just bitter and angry all the way up to the point of death, well then, again, maybe doesn't have so much benefit. But it's a self-defense mechanism. It's keeping us from having to experience the pain of that reality of our own passing. The third that was taught by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in terms of getting to acceptance of one's own death was bargaining. And that's where you may not be able to physically bargain, you know, like, oh, what can I do, you know, to have someone else go instead of me, or to, you know, be able to avoid my own death. But we have a mentality that wants to do that, right? People who are in a theistic tradition, for example, might think, well, I'll devote my life to God if only he'll spare me from having to, you know, succumb to this cancer or whatever. Well, you know, these are ways of trying to find a way out. You're not at acceptance yet because you're not embracing the reality of that. Instead, you're trying to find an exit door that will be there through the force of some form of bargaining, whatever that might look like. The fourth one is our depression. We talked about this a little bit last night with Vanessa's comment in terms of the sadness that can be there after the loss of someone. Of course, when we come to it with our own mortality, as Elizabeth Kubler-Ross taught it, then we often have to face the sadness of losing our own life, of that having to say goodbye to all that we love, all the things in our life, to no longer having this experience of this human life. In Buddhism, again, it might have a slightly different dimension because we know that there is life beyond this through rebirth and so on. So this isn't the end of the line in regard to forever and the person being utterly gone, but nonetheless, it's still a very important point to mark in regard to this life coming to an end. And some form of sadness or depression is almost inevitable that we'll experience, as we'll see when we talk about these in terms of grief. The last of these 5 stages that she identified in observing people going through accepting their own death was the stage of acceptance. And acceptance, of course, being where you have gotten to a place of acknowledging that reality, where you're sort of maybe not completely at peace with it, but you're no longer going to kind of try to refuse that reality and do other things to avoid it in some way through bargaining or other mechanisms. You then are more at peace to be able to actually die with a mind that has acknowledged that loss and can therefore, go forward. So these are important stages to acknowledge, even within a Buddhist context. I think it would be even the rare Buddhist practitioner who would hear a prognosis on their own life and immediately get to a place of acceptance. I don't think that that's necessarily what Buddhism prepares us to do, but it prepares us to have a context in which we can understand these stages, this process. Now, I will admit that, or I remind you, perhaps it's a better word, that David Kessler, in the book that I cited from previously, and I will cite a few things from there, he wrote a book on what he calls the sixth stage of grief. And we have the sixth stage, perhaps, of that, even with regard to accepting one's own mortality. And that's the stage of finding meaning. As I said, sometimes when people are given a prognosis, it causes them to not just get to a place of acceptance, but for a place to where they can actually find greater meaning in their remaining days, through devoting their lives to whatever causes they might feel a closeness to making sure that their estate is managed to where the resources that they've left behind are used in a beneficial way. All those sorts of things are part of finding meaning that stem from having an acceptance of one's mortality. But in regard to the processes with grief, they become even more important. That's why I think he devoted an entire book to talking about that in regard to grief. Why? Because as I said last night, when you deal with the 5 stages with regard to death, your own mortality, you've got a period that's happening there, right? That is going to happen. Your own death will occur on the basis of this whole preparation through these stages. When we're dealing with the stages in regard to grief, there's no sort of period other than our own death, which will come at some point, but grief is a process that continues throughout one's life. We continue to have that grief, albeit in subtler ways, because as David Kessler mentioned, we become bigger. The grief seems to become smaller because we become bigger in our own resources, our own strength, our own courage, and what have you. But nonetheless, we aren't, there's no kind of demarcation of, okay, the grief is over now. A lot of people like to put time limits on grief. I remember when I was going through my process, there was a lot of talk of like a year. There is something that's very profound about that first year. Many of you have experienced that from the loss of a loved one, because you go through all of the various occasions of a year, all the various holidays, the birthdays, the anniversaries, all the various things that you commemorate that you no longer have that person there to celebrate with. And so you do have something that's quite profound about a year. But nonetheless, that's not expected that after a year, your grief is gone and it's no longer a part of you. As I said, grief is something that actually can continue with you for many, many years throughout your entire life. Becomes much subtler and not so pronounced. But it is important that we have that understanding with these processes of grief, that while we might be able to shed some of them and let them go and perhaps get to that place of acceptance, nonetheless, the other stages of finding meaning and utilizing that acceptance in our lives will continue throughout the rest of this life. It's not something that actually, again, has a sort of ending point. Is everybody clear about what I'm saying in regard to that? So let's go through these and just talk about them briefly, even though we already have gone through them to some degree by talking about them in regard to one's own death. Let's talk about them in regard to grieving. So in regard to denial, when it comes to grieving, we see it as perhaps being a little more symbolic than literal, right? Because when you have dealt with the reality of the death of a loved one, and perhaps you've been with their lifeless body, you've seen the reality of them no longer being alive. The denial isn't quite the same as when you're dealing with your own prognosis of so many months from a particular illness or what have you. So I think there is something a little bit more symbolic to it rather than literal. It's more like we have those thoughts, and oftentimes we even say that, oh, I can't believe that they've gone. I can't believe that they're no longer here, right? That's a form of this denial, where you're still in a space of the disbelief that is manifesting in a very sort of otherworldly way, where you feel like you're in a dream, perhaps. There's not really something tangible that you can point to that is validating it. But nonetheless, you do accept it at some level that it's happened. It's not that you have utter denial, but nonetheless, it doesn't seem as real. And so that can happen for some period of time for people. That's why in our culture, again, we don't have so many good rituals even around death and dying to facilitate that initial stage of getting through some of the denial of that. Uh, during the pandemic, I don't know what it was like for people when they lost loved ones and they couldn't even, be with them in their last moments to see that transition out of this life. They couldn't often have the funerals and things that they would normally have because of what was going on. People not needing to or being not allowed to congregate and what have you. There was so much that was denied people in terms of their reality of the loss of their loved one. I'm sure their grieving process was delayed greatly because of their own denial within themselves. So again, know that oftentimes it's more symbolic, but there can be more literal periods, certainly, or literal times when we are denied that closure because we have not been able to go through some of the process that is there around death and dying. Anger, in our grief, anger can take a lot of different dimensions as well. We can have anger certainly at the causes of that person's passing. Sometimes people do pass away from perhaps their own neglect of certain things, that pertain to their health. We might think, well, someone who died of lung cancer, who perhaps was a smoker, then we might be angry at them for having, kept smoking for so long and not paid attention to their own health. We might have anger at the injustice or the unfairness of that loss in our lives. I'm sure that when it comes to people who've lost loved ones to murder, these shootings, what have you, they might feel it's incredibly unjust. Why was their loved one taken? That person was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. There was no logical reason for them to have lost their lives. So anger can manifest at that time. Anger can also manifest as the inability to stop their death from happening. We like to feel like we're in control. I think this is a delusion we all work with to some degree in this life, to think that somehow we could possibly keep others from having to experience various things. I'm sure that goes on for these parents of kids lost in school shootings as well. I should have been there to protect my child from this. I should have done something else that would have caused this to not happen. But we do this with regard to so many of our losses, and it's really not a fair assessment because we don't have that much control. We don't know when death is going to come for others or what sorts of things might play a role in that. But this inability to stop it from happening can be a source of our own anger, sort of a internal anger. And of course, when anger gets internalized and we start getting angry at ourselves, that often manifests as guilt, right? We feel very guilty that we didn't do what we needed to do to help that person to a greater degree, to help address maybe the medical problems they were having or whatever it was that manifested. We sometimes even get mad at others who aren't experiencing what we're experiencing. I have to admit I had a bit of this myself. When I dealt with the loss of my partner, of course, I was 34 years old. It's kind of young to lose someone, but people lose others in their lives at all ages. But nonetheless, I looked to my college friends and people that I had in my life at the time, and I really felt that they were not of much consolation at all. I mean, they didn't really do much to help me. They weren't calling me or writing me or paying much attention to what I was going through. And I kind of got angry at it. And I actually wrote a letter to one of them who I felt, one of my closer friends who I felt really wasn't of course, it was a mind of attachment. I have to admit, it was my own kind of seeking out something from my own side. I wasn't quite clear on all of that yet. And I've apologized to him since then, that I kind of feel bad that I put that all on him and what have you. But this is oftentimes the case, when others around us are living their lives, they're going on vacation, they're doing all the things, and we're in a state of grief. Anger can manifest at them. And that's, again, somewhat unfair because they're not going through our experience. They don't know what it's like, perhaps, to be on the side of experiencing such deep loss and grief. So anger can manifest in a variety of ways. Now, again, within a Buddhist perspective, anger does have a negative connotation. But once more, we have to see it in the light of it being a defense mechanism. It's keeping us from feeling that complete pain of that loss at that time by funneling that feeling towards other avenues, towards the causes of that person's passing or towards others who aren't experiencing the grief or whatever. it becomes problematic only when it becomes excessive, where we become a very angry and bitter person ourselves and close ourselves off from loving others on the basis of that. But again, it's completely understandable that anger will happen, even for Buddhists. As you know, His Holiness has admitted on a number of occasions, he does have some anger, but he says it very quickly becomes compassion, right? Very quickly becomes another emotion that's more beneficial. The stage of bargaining, where with the person who's dying, they're kind of looking for ways out. There's maybe, again, a sort of, you can't get a way out of this, but you have a lot of this what if or if only thinking going on, right? Well, if only, they had done this and I had done that and whatever, then maybe they wouldn't be gone now. Maybe I wouldn't be experiencing that loss. I even had this with a cat who passed away earlier this year. I was fairly close to. I guess I'm still experiencing some of the grief of that loss. But nonetheless, I go through some thinking of like, well, if only I had taken the cat to the doctor sooner, if only I had done this, what if I had pursued this avenue of treatment or whatever, and wonder if the cat might still be here. But I made decisions at the time that I have to respect and be okay with. But this bargaining mind is always kind of looking at, well, what if I'd done something different? What if I could change that? We may not believe that it's actually possible to avoid that, but once more, it provides relief. It's a way to kind of restore some order to the chaos of grief, to kind of say, well, I'm going to go into that more or less problem-solving mode that bargaining is all about, right? And maybe we'll stop here. I realize we're kind of stopping right in the middle of this, but this is before we get to the depression, the acceptance, and then look at meaning to some degree. But these stages, again, I want to emphasize, and maybe I will read one or two passages on that before I conclude today, how this is really much more circular than what we talk about in general with regard to the linear process that they're set out in. So let me see if I can find those quotes. He says here, where do I have that? It's actually in the other book. Where did I do with that? Okay, sorry, I meant to have all these again queued up and what have you. He says, people often think of, yeah, this is one thing that's important along this line. People often think of the stages, this is from On Grief and Grieving. People often think of the stages as lasting weeks or months. They forget that the stages are responses to feelings that can last for minutes or hours as we flip in and out of one and then another. We do not enter and leave each individual stage in a linear fashion. We may feel one, then another, and back again to the first one. So again, this is with regard to grief, this is more pronounced, I think. That's why sometimes we might feel like, okay, I think I've gotten to the other side of this, but then something happens and then we're back in that same place of that pain feeling much fresher than what we thought it would be. Another little introduction to these that I meant to read when we first started was from David Kessler's book on grief and grieving. He says the stages have evolved since their introduction, and they have been very misunderstood over the past 3 decades. They were never meant to help tuck messy emotions into neat packages. They are responses to loss that many people have, but there is not a typical response to loss, as there is no typical loss. Our grief is as individual as our lives. These 5 stages are a part of the framework that makes up our learning to live with the one we lost. They are tools to help us frame and identify what we may be feeling, but they are not stops on some linear timeline in grief. Not everyone goes through all of them or goes in a prescribed manner. So there are ways that we can kind of put a handle on our grief, learn to cope with our grief, be able to identify various things that are going on with our grief. But know that, again, there's no sort of set formula to all of this, no timeline, no dimension of you have to go through this stage by this particular time, and then the next stage will follow. So I hope that's been some use to at least begin that process of looking at them. I'll briefly review them before we go back into the other 2 remaining tomorrow. But are there any comments or questions about what I presented on those today? Yes, Lorna.
Yeah, I'd just like to, when you were talking about the denial, as I witnessed my brother, his wife had, this was 20 years ago, but had been diagnosed with basically terminal breast cancer. And he was in such deep denial that she it became about him and not her. And he wouldn't allow her to talk about what she was experiencing and how she was feeling about it. She had accepted that she was going to die soon, but he couldn't accept it, and they were going to fight this, and she was going to get better, and they were going to head off on their happier lives. So I witnessed how his denial left her feeling lonely, and kind of unsupported by him in what she was ultimately going to be facing. And I think that's something we forget about, is the person who is affected, needs that space and that support, in terms of what they're dealing with, and to be able to talk about it and their fears and whatever that is. But that really made a big impact on me to witness that, from her point of view, and how it affected her in the last months of her life.
All right. And how unfortunate for not just her, but also for him,
Yes.
to not be able to get to that place of acceptance before she passed,
Yeah.
so that he then could have perhaps a different healing process on the other side of her passing. So,
Well,
yeah,
and the
but
tragedy of that was he died a month later after her from a massive heart attack. So it was just a
so
double
sad.
whammy for their
Yeah.
son, right? But it was just kind of tragic all the way around from that point of view.
Oh my gosh, Lorna. I'm so sorry that happened in that way, but this does happen, as we witness here, but it even happens pretty commonly when people haven't been able to kind of process their own acceptance of that one who's passed, then they succumb to death themselves. But yeah, this is why I was pointing out that grief also is sort of held within the body. And if this is, I don't know, again, that he was able to experience any of his grieving in that time before passing, but probably it became something that festered within him that caused some disease within his body.
Yeah.
I'm not a medical expert by any means, but we can certainly,
Understood.
make that connection to some degree without too much problem, I think. But
Yeah.
thank you for sharing that. I think it is really important that we understand that our own denial with others who are going through that, it does have a bearing on them. Does keep them from getting, even though it sounds like she was able to get to her place of acceptance herself, it wasn't in a good way. She had to do it on her own, and be isolated to some degree in that experience. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. It's important to acknowledge all the dimensions of these stages, because we all will go through them in a variety of ways, with regard to others who are passing, with regard to our own death, with regard to the grieving process, and they get mirrored as we're, just exploring here in our grief. So anyone else want to share anything before we conclude today?
Yeah, I have a similar experience to Lorna. I think what was most traumatic for me during my mom's passing was my stepdad, the way he was grieving, was it's about me, who's going to take care of me, who's going to feed me. I'm the one who's losing weight. And I think that was the toughest part of my mom passing away, was him. And he just became really nasty. And I don't know if it was his coping mechanism, or it was that he was just only nice to us because of my mom. And now that my mom's gone, he doesn't care. He just completely turned his back against us. But
sort of behavior, and how he was, working from that place of self-centeredness, but to acknowledge that that was perhaps all he was capable of doing, that I have this sort of idea. I've never heard a Tibetan Buddhist teacher say this, but my way of looking at people often, if I can really think about it, be conscious of it, is to acknowledge that it's in some way we're all doing the best that we can. If we could do better, we would do better. It's not to give people a pass and to say, well, everybody's just doing the best they can. Putin is doing the best that he can, and all these people up to mayhem in the world are doing the best that they can. They have a kind of a ticket to ride. Then it's not that. It's saying that I have an understanding that based on all the causes and conditions that led someone to be a particular way, that they're under the control of that, and they are manifesting that, and don't really have much choice in the matter. It's not to say that they couldn't be better, because that's sort of the footnote to all of this. They're doing the best they can, but they could do better given different circumstances, given different causes and conditions. You know, if Putin or any person in the world who's up to, horrible mayhem, if they were to find something that actually helped change their minds, that opened their heart, that saw what they were doing in a different light, then they would do something different. But they haven't had that. They haven't had the good fortune of having, positive influences in their life that would lead them to be engaged in much more beneficial and wholesome actions. So it's not, again, giving people a pass, but it's giving an understanding that whoever it is that we're observing and whatever their behavior is, they're working with it as best as they can. And yes, they might be hurting other people in the process. They might be neglecting other people in the process. And we can be not okay with that element of it, but we have some understanding, some dimension of kind of awareness that helps us to see it in that light and perhaps have some compassion for them, because we recognize that they don't have the causes and conditions that lead us to be perhaps more aware, more in touch with things, so that we can have more wholesome reactions to things in our world. So I don't know if that helps a little, just to give some space around it. Again, it's not to give people a pass, but to have that understanding, that awareness.
Thank you.
Yes, Carol.
Just a quick thought, Vanessa, that reminded me when my dad passed away very unexpectedly. I was on a plane on my way back from London, so I didn't find out until like 2 a.m. when I got home. And my mother, it took her, she stayed in denial for such a long time. She would not allow us to have any kind of a follow-up memorial or service or anything for my dad. And I tried to explain to her that we all needed to come together and celebrate his life and that passing. And she just shut down completely. She would not let my sister or I do anything. Finally, after 6 or 7 months, we were able to take his ashes down to Victoria Beach in Laguna, which is where he loved. And even then, there were like only 2 or 3 of us there. And all of our rest of our family was trying to cope with my dad's passing and in shock that we could not come together. It wasn't until my mother passed away 10, 15 years later, and I did do a big party for her celebration of her life and my dad's at the same time. So all of our family could come together and celebrate them both. But she just shut down. I'd forgotten about that until Vanessa, you started to talk about that. And also, the other comment about the husband who was in denial. And it was very hard for all of us in the family not to be able to come together and grieve. But my mother was doing, as you said, and I look back at it, she just was doing the best she could. She was there when he died in the kitchen floor, and I think she stayed on that kitchen floor with my dad's body for years until she could, finally move on.
Yeah. And when we understand that this is, again, perhaps a self-defense mechanism, that they don't want to be in that place of pain, the thought of being surrounded by all the family and having to endure that is just so heavy at that time.
I think she just couldn't do it. Well, she just couldn't.
So we can have some sort of honoring of it, as much as, again, it is not so good for those who needed that as closure and as an ability to grieve together, to begin that process in that way. So yeah, these are sad experiences to hear about, but again, they're just experiences, and we can choose to see them in the way we want to and make of them what we will, so that we can, again, continually be aware of that and how we ourselves want to approach these situations in the future and help others to do the same. So, good.
Thank you.
All right, well, let's conclude for today. And when we get back together tomorrow, we will be going into the harder ones, or the hardest one, perhaps the depression, and talking a little bit about that stage and how that manifests around grief. We touched on that a little bit last night, but I do want to spend a bit more time on that. And then we'll carry on and actually get into some of the Buddhist teachings that we can also use to be avenues of exploration through our grief. So just have a few thoughts of sort of